You need to hear exactly what happened in that room because it's the kind of moment careers get remembered for 43 days. That's how long Brian Rolap had been running the PGA Tour before Jordan Spieth stood up in front of the entire leadership team and said the thing nobody else in that room had the nerve to say. So, what could possibly push one of the most respected players in golf to publicly expose the man weeks into his leadership? And more importantly, what did Spieth know that made staying quiet no longer an option? This didn't start as one disagreement or one bad decision. It started as something quieter and slower. Concerns from players piling up, promises going nowhere, decisions getting made that would reshape the future of professional golf for a generation that hadn't even arrived yet. For a long time, Spieth handled it the way he handled everything, privately, patiently, behind closed doors. He wasn't trying to create drama. He was trying to force a conversation that, by every account, should have happened long before it did. Do you think Jordan Spieth was right to speak out? Or did he cross a line by calling out Brian Rolap in front of his own staff? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want the real stories behind golf's biggest power struggles, make sure you're subscribed, because this one only gets more shocking from here. That powerful man was Brian Rolap, and to understand why Spieth finally broke, you need to understand who Rolap actually is. He spent over 2 decades in the NFL turning football into a money-printing machine. When the tour brought him in, the mandate was simple. Do the same thing for golf. More money, bigger deals, fewer headaches. But Rolap never saw golf the way the players saw it. To him, this was never about tradition or history or the magic of a Sunday afternoon at a classic course. It was about numbers, ratings, revenue, growth. Every decision traced back to that same cold calculation, and he moved fast. Within months, rolling out a 2-tier system built to separate the elite from everyone else. So was Rolap actually the villain here? Or was he simply doing exactly what he was hired to do? That question is worth sitting with, because the more Spieth watched, the clearer the answer became. Young players were getting squeezed out of chances entirely, the system quietly built to protect the handful already at the top. It hit Spieth that Rolap wasn't just indifferent to what the players thought. He'd stopped pretending to care at all. For Rolap, there was only one priority: his plan, his legacy, his way of doing things on his timeline, whether the people who'd spent their careers building the tour agreed with it or not. The tension built for months. Spieth kept raising it in meetings, calling out the hypocrisy baked into the new rules, and every single time, Rolap deflected. Empty reassurances, promises it would work out. Nothing ever changed. Meanwhile, the schedule kept getting rewritten around the same handful of marquee names. Purses kept shrinking for everyone outside the top tier, and the gap between the tour's public messaging and its private decisions kept widening. The machine ground on, and the players kept absorbing the cost. Then came the moment that broke it open, and it didn't happen in front of cameras. Rolap pulled Spieth aside for what was billed as a private chat. It wasn't a chat. It was a warning. Rolap told him flatly that he needed to get in line, stop undermining the tour's future, fall in with the direction leadership had already chosen. Spieth just stood there. Was this the moment he backed down for good, or the moment that changed everything that came after? Because here's what stayed with him long after that conversation ended. The direction of the tour had already been decided, and player input mattered less with every passing decision. That realization changed how Spieth saw his own role. For years, he'd worked behind the scenes, committees, difficult conversations, the belief that compromise was still possible if the right people sat down together. But the more he saw, the harder it became to believe real dialogue was still happening at all. And what actually frustrated him wasn't his own career. He'd already accomplished more than most golfers ever will. It was watching decisions get made that would follow the next generation of players for decades without their voices carrying any real weight in the room. That private conversation could have been the end of the story. Plenty of people in his position would have taken the warning, nodded, and moved on. Instead, it became the exact moment Spieth understood that quietly disagreeing behind closed doors had stopped working. a man who'd spent years searching for common ground, was now preparing to do the one thing he'd avoided his entire career: say publicly what everyone else was only willing to whisper. For the top tier, the perks kept flowing. For everyone else, smaller purses, fewer opportunities, a fraction of the exposure. In the boardroom, that read as progress. To the players actually living under it, it read like a slow death sentence for dozens of careers. And the hypocrisy stung worse than any of it. Rolap loved the language of earning your spot. Meritocracy, competition, merit-based opportunity. But underneath the speeches, the system was quietly rigged, bending for the biggest names, while everyone else fought over what was left. Nobody understood that better than Spieth. He'd watched decades-old events get pushed to the margins: the Canadian Open, the Colonial, the Phoenix Open. Tournaments that weren't just dates on a calendar, but the actual backbone of the sport's history. The events players grew up dreaming about long before they ever heard the words signature event. And then it got personal. In 2025, Spieth fell outside the automatic qualifying window for several signature events. A three-time major champion, a man who'd earned millions and represented the tour with class for over a decade, reduced to requesting sponsor exemptions just to tee it up. 5 separate times he had to ask permission to play events he'd helped build in the first place. This wasn't about the money. It was about a system that no longer rewarded performance at all. If a 3-time major champion has to beg to compete, what does that tell you about who the new system was actually built for? Here's the part Spieth genuinely couldn't stomach. He was one of the players who benefited from exactly that unfairness. He got the exemptions because of who he was, not because the system was fair and that didn't make it acceptable. It made it worse because he knew exactly who was paying the price. Younger, hungrier players who actually deserved those spots were the ones getting pushed aside instead. So he raised it privately again. He sat with Rolap, laid out how the new rules were eroding the tour's credibility, pointed out every contradiction, made his case with facts and logic and an obvious love for the game. And once again, he got dismissed, talked down to like he didn't understand how the real world worked. Everyone assumed the story ended there, with Spieth quietly accepting the same brush-off he'd gotten every time before. It didn't, because next came the moment that made the double standard impossible for anyone to ignore. When the tour announced Spieth wouldn't be penalized for playing a lighter schedule, fans lost it. Social media exploded overnight. The rules were bending for the biggest name in the room, and the jokes wrote themselves. Spieth wasn't just embarrassed, he was furious. Not because he wanted to be punished, but because the special treatment made him look exactly like the hypocrite he'd spent months fighting against. When the system protects its biggest stars from the very rules it enforces on everyone else, can you even call it a meritocracy anymore? He'd spent months speaking out for fairness and consistency, and the tour turned around and handed him a free pass he never asked for. Overnight, everything he'd said started to sound hollow. He looked like another entitled superstar wanting the perks with none of the obligations. But that wasn't the truth. He hadn't requested the exemption. He'd told the tour back at the end of 2025 that he'd be playing a lighter schedule, upfront about it from the start. Instead of respecting that honesty, the tour used his name as proof the rules could bend whenever it suited them, sacrificing his credibility to protect their own image. There were 3 moments that could have ended this differently. The private warning was the first. The exemption controversy was the second. This was the exact point Spieth understood the third was coming, because nothing was going to change on its own. This had stopped being about fairness. It was about control. A tour that wanted players who followed orders, smiled, nodded, and never asked hard questions. Anyone who spoke up got handled one way or another. But there's a thing about Jordan Spieth people kept forgetting. His entire career was built on proving people wrong. Counted out during his slump, told he'd never win another major, and every time, he came back harder. So when Rolap tried to box him into a corner, Spieth did what he'd always done. He fought back, not with lawyers, not with a statement to the press, but with the truth in a room full of the people who needed to hear it most. Would you have had the nerve to say it out loud in that room? Or would you have stayed quiet like everyone else? Drop your answer in the comments, and if you're invested in how this plays out, hit subscribe before we get to exactly what Spieth said. The private warning was the final straw, but the real detonation was still coming, and nobody in that room saw it building. The meeting was billed as routine. Rolap stood at the front, running through his usual pitch: growth, revenue, staying competitive in a crowded sports market. Players sat there half listening to a version of the same presentation they'd sat through a dozen times. This time was different. Spieth had been pushed too far, dismissed too many times, and watched the tour chip away at its own credibility for months. Somewhere in there, he'd crossed into a place where consequences stopped mattering to him. When Rolap wrapped up and opened the floor for questions, Spieth stood. The room went still instantly. Everyone felt the shift in the air. This wasn't going to be some polite question about scheduling or purse sizes. Spieth scanned the room. The executives with their rehearsed smiles. The players who'd stayed quiet for years. Everyone who had let this system take root without a fight. Then he turned to Rolap and started talking. He didn't bring up money. He didn't bring up ratings. He talked about the soul of the game. The tournaments pushed to the margins. The players squeezed out. The hypocrisy of preaching meritocracy while bending every rule for a chosen few. Then he asked the question nobody had dared ask. How could the tour tell a young player grinding on the Corn Ferry to earn his card when the men at the very top weren't earning their own spots under that same system? The room didn't just go quiet. It went dead. He called the Challenger Series a glorified feeder tour dressed up as progress. He said the classic events deserved better than getting shoved aside for corporate convenience, and that the tour was losing its identity while no one in charge seemed to care. Every sentence landed like a gut punch. The executives shifted in their seats. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. The kind of dead air that makes you question whether it's actually happening. That was the moment Jordan Spieth stopped being just another player and became the voice the whole room had been too afraid to use. This wasn't a policy disagreement anymore. It was a war between the players who built the game and the executives trying to remake it in their own image. Tradition against profit, integrity against convenience, and that stillness in the room was the most honest reaction anyone had given in months. What came next made that meeting look tame. When Spieth sat back down, nobody knew what to say. The executives looked to Rolap, waiting for a response. Rolap sat there frozen, working hard to hold his composure, because power only works as long as people believe in it, and in that room, full of people who'd been following orders for years, the belief had just cracked. Spieth hadn't said anything new. He'd said the thing everyone already knew, but had been too afraid to speak, and there was no putting that back in the bottle. Rolap eventually mumbled something about addressing the concerns privately, but the damage was already visible. He'd been publicly challenged in front of his own staff, his authority questioned out loud, and there was nothing he could do to undo it. The fallout spread fast. Players started talking to each other differently, more openly, comparing notes on frustrations they'd assumed were theirs alone, trading stories about the same closed-door dismissals Spieth had just described out loud. Text threads that used to stay quiet started filling up. Agents started fielding questions they didn't have answers to. The silence Spieth had broken wasn't just his. It belonged to an entire locker room. That had been waiting for someone to go first, and Rolap, he was cornered. Sponsors are watching nervously, quietly asking questions about locker room morale they never used to ask. Broadcast partners are getting anxious. Nobody wants to bankroll a tour that looks like it's cracking from the inside. But for the first time, the players are united, and they've seen exactly what silence costs. Rolap's options are running thin. Push forward and ignore the growing resistance. Try to split the locker room by offering the biggest names special deals. Quietly walk back the two-tier system before it does more damage, or admit he got something wrong and actually listen to the people who play the game. Pride is a dangerous thing, and admitting failure has never come easily to powerful men. This isn't a disagreement anymore. It's a war of principles, and both sides are digging in. So, here's where things stand. Jordan Spieth walked into that room a diplomat and walked out a revolutionary. He put his reputation, his relationships, and his future in the sport on the line because he believed in something bigger than himself: the game, the players, and the idea that the tour could still be better than what it had become. The room fell silent that day because nobody had an answer for the truth, and in that silence, a new era started. An era where players finally found their voice, where the corporate suits couldn't hide behind polished slides anymore, where the silence was broken for good. This was never just about one meeting. It was about whether the players or the boardroom actually run professional golf from here, and about whether the next Jordan Spieth coming up through junior golf right now will ever have to make the same choice between staying quiet and speaking up. Will Rolap double down and risk a full-scale rebellion? Or will he finally admit the players deserve a real voice in decisions that shape their careers? Nobody knows yet. So tell me, where are you watching from? And if you'd been in that room, would you have stood up with Spieth or stayed in your seat like everyone else? Let me know in the comments and hit subscribe if you want to be here when we find out how this actually ends.